The wind howled like 1,000 voices across the empty roads of rural Montana, sweeping sheets of snow into the night. The storm was merciless, its icy grip locking down every living thing that dared to move through the valley. In the midst of that blizzard stood a small, aging house, paint peeling, roof patched with tin, and windows glowing with a dim flicker of kerosene lamps. Inside, warmth clung stubbornly to the walls, refusing to yield to the cold. And in that house lived a black grandmother, known to everyone simply as Miss Clara. Miss Clara was not a woman of wealth, nor was she a woman of renown. Her life had been marked by struggle, by the long shadows of discrimination, and by the endless labor it took to raise children and grandchildren in a world that often denied them fairness. But she carried herself with a quiet dignity, the kind that came not from titles or recognition, but from resilience. She was one of those souls who understood suffering and chose, time after time, to answer it with kindness. That night, the storm battered her little home as she sat beside the fire, knitting with fingers worn from years of work. Every so often she glanced at the window, watching the snow pile higher against the glass. It was the kind of storm that swallowed men whole, the kind that turned strong engines to silent blocks of ice. And somewhere out there, far down the frozen highway, 9 men were caught in its teeth. They were not ordinary men. They were Hell's Angels, a name that carried both fear and awe wherever it was spoken. To the world, they were outlaws, dangerous bikers who moved in thunderous packs and demanded respect with leather jackets and steel machines. Yet at that moment, beneath the furious snow, they were simply human beings, cold, stranded, and vulnerable. Their motorcycles had long since failed them, engines choking in the freezing air. They had abandoned the bikes along the roadside, trudging through the storm in search of shelter. Each step was a war. Snow clung to their beards, ice burnt their skin, and the night pressed on them with suffocating weight. When they saw the faint glow of Miss Clara's lamp in the distance, they moved toward it like men chasing salvation. The sound of fists against her door startled Clara. For a moment, she froze. In her long life, she had known the bitter sting of racism, the way strangers' knocks could carry danger. And the storm outside only made the interruption more foreboding. Gathering her courage, she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and went to the door. When she opened it, the wind nearly tore it from her hands. And standing there, looming large against the storm, were 9 men, rough, weather-beaten, and dressed in leather. Their jackets bore the emblem she instantly recognized, a grinning skull with wings, the mark of the Hell's Angels. Her heart clenched. These were men she had heard about in whispers, stories of violence, of outlaws who rode into towns and left destruction behind. For an instant, every instinct screamed at her to slam the door shut, to protect herself. But then she looked closer. Beneath the frost and toughness, she saw their faces, red from the cold, lips trembling, eyes desperate. They weren't there to threaten. They were there to survive. One of them stepped forward, his voice hoarse from the storm. "Ma'am," he said, we don't mean any harm. Just need a place to get warm, just for a bit." Silence filled the doorway, the snow swirling around them like restless ghosts. Clara's mind raced. 9 men, all strangers, all carrying reputations that made her neighbors shudder. Yet behind them, she could see the storm tearing through the world, a death sentence for anyone left in its fury. And in that moment, Clara remembered something her own grandmother had told her long ago, words she carried like scripture. The Lord doesn't put people at your door by accident. If they come hungry, feed them. If they come cold, warm them. What they do with that mercy isn't on you, it's on them. So Clara stepped aside. "Come in," she said softly. The men shuffled inside, stamping snow from their boots. They filled the small home with their sighs, their presence overwhelming the little space. For a moment, there was awkwardness. 9 burly bikers huddled in a room that smelt of cornbread and wood smoke, their roughness clashing against the delicate lace curtains Clara had sewn herself. She wasted no time. "Sit down by the fire," she ordered, her voice carrying the authority of every grandmother who had ever ruled a household. "You all look half frozen." Something about her tone disarmed them. They obeyed. Soon the room was alive with the hiss of melting snow, the crackle of wood, and the sighs of men whose bodies were beginning to thaw. Clara went to her kitchen and set about preparing what food she had. Her cupboards were not full, her pension stretched thin, but she knew the value of a hot meal on a night like that. She ladled soup into bowls, thick with beans and vegetables she had canned herself last summer. She sliced cornbread and poured hot coffee. And as she carried the food to the table, she saw something remarkable. These hardened men, feared by many, bowed their heads in thanks before they ate. Conversation came slowly at first. The men were cautious, and Clara was still measuring them with a watchful eye. But as the night wore on, the walls between them thinned. They told her their names, their stories of the road, and how the storm had caught them on their way to a rally. And she, in turn, told them about her life, the children she had raised, the husband she had buried, and the prejudice she had endured in that little town. The men listened, really listened. For perhaps the first time in a long time, Clara felt seen, not as just a black woman in a rural town, but as a human being whose stories mattered. Hours passed. The storm raged on outside, but inside Clara's home, there was warmth, not just of fire, but of connection. At one point, one of the younger bikers noticed the Bible on her shelf. He asked if she still read it. Clara smiled, her eyes glinting. "Every day," she said. "What's your favorite part?" he asked. She looked at him, her voice steady. "The part that says we're supposed to love our neighbors, even when it's hard, even when the world says otherwise." The words hung in the room like a benediction. By dawn, the storm had begun to ease. The bikers gathered their things, preparing to face the road again. But before they left, the eldest among them, broad-shouldered, with a face carved by years of wind and grit, turned to Clara. "You didn't have to do this," he said, his voice low but firm. 9 of us showing up at your door in the middle of the night? Most folks would have run us off with a shotgun. But you took us in." Clara shrugged, pulling her shawl tighter. "Storm don't care what color you are or what patch you wear on your back. Cold's the same for everybody." The man nodded, a rare softness in his eyes. "Well, ma'am, I can't speak for the whole world, but from this day on, you've got 9 angels watching over you. Anyone messes with you, they mess with us." And with that, they left, disappearing into the white morning. Clara stood in her doorway, watching them go, her heart both heavy and light. She had no way of knowing then how serious they were, or how profoundly that night would ripple through the rest of her life. But she did know this. In a world where she had often been left unprotected, she had just gained 9 unlikely guardians. The winter storm faded into memory, but the promise made within Clara's little house remained heavy in the air. For the bikers, it might have seemed like a moment of gratitude, a vow spoken in the quiet dawn after a night of survival. But for Miss Clara, life carried on as it always had, measured in small routines, in the weight of the past, and in the daily grind of dignity earned, not given. Weeks passed. The snow thawed into streams that ran muddy through the countryside. Neighbors whispered, as they often did. Word had spread. Clara had opened her home to 9 men wearing jackets no God-fearing townsfolk dared to associate with. For some, it was proof of her foolishness. For others, it was one more reason to look down on her, as though a black woman in their community needed another mark against her. "You're too trusting," one neighbor muttered at the market. "Those men aren't saints. They'll bring you trouble." Clara met the warning with the same calm she always carried. "I don't judge a man by the patch on his back. I judge him by what he does in front of me." But deep down, Clara knew that hospitality came with risk. She had lived long enough to understand the fragile line she walked. Black, widowed, aging, and alone in a town that never truly accepted her. She had learned to survive by holding her head high, by keeping her home in order, and by never asking for more than what she could give herself. What she did not expect was that the vow spoken by the Hell's Angels was not empty. The first time it happened, Clara was returning from church on a bright Sunday morning. The service had been full of hymns, her favorite kind of Sunday, the kind that reminded her of her mother's voice rising strong and unshaken during the worst years of segregation. She walked the long stretch of road back to her house, Bible in hand, when she noticed two men leaning against her gate. They were not familiar faces. One had the sharp, jittery look of someone always hunting for trouble, the other with eyes that lingered too long on her purse. Clara felt her stomach tighten, but she did what she always did. She straightened her spine and kept walking. "Afternoon, ma'am," one of them called, a crooked smile splitting his face. "Pretty book you got there. Might let us take a look?" Clara gripped the Bible tighter. "This book isn't for stealing," she said firmly, moving past them toward her gate. The men exchanged glances, their bodies shifting to block her way. Clara's heart raced. She had faced intimidation before. Ugly words, cold stares, but something in their eyes was sharper. She whispered a prayer beneath her breath, asking for strength. Then came a sound, a low, rolling thunder that grew louder with each second. Clara turned her head, and down the road came 9 motorcycles, engines roaring like a storm reborn. The men at her gate stiffened. Dust kicked up as the bike slowed, circling around like predators, but they weren't there for Clara. They were there for her. The leader, the same broad-shouldered man from that blizzard night, cut his engine and removed his helmet. His eyes fixed on the two strangers, his voice calm but edged with iron. "Something wrong here?" The strangers shifted, muttering excuses, their bravado dissolving under the weight of 9 watchful stares. Within moments, they were gone, retreating down the road as quickly as they had come. Clara stood frozen, her pulse pounding. The leader turned to her, his expression softening. "Are you all right, Miss Clara?" She exhaled, her shoulders loosening. "I am now." That day marked the beginning of something extraordinary. The vow spoken in her living room had become flesh, rolling down the roads on 2 wheels and leather jackets. From then on, Clara noticed their presence, sometimes distant, sometimes close. A motorcycle was idling at the corner when she walked home at night. A figure stood watch near her fence when rumors stirred of trouble. Not intrusive, never threatening, simply protective, like guardians who understood that safety was a currency often denied to people like her. For Clara, it was more than just protection. It was vindication. For decades, she had endured the cruel arithmetic of being a black woman in America, where safety was never guaranteed, where respect had to be demanded, and where dignity was too often denied. And now, here were 9 men the world called outlaws, treating her with a reverence the law itself had often failed to give. But not everyone saw it that way. The sheriff came knocking one evening, his car pulling up with lights that washed her little home in red and blue. Clara opened the door, her shawl wrapped tight, her face calm. "Evening, Miss Clara," the sheriff said, tipping his hat. His tone was polite, but his eyes were sharp. "We've had reports. Folks say you're keeping company with certain men." Clara met his stare without flinching. "I don't keep company, Sheriff. I offered shelter on a cold night, and those men didn't forget my kindness." The sheriff shifted, clearly dissatisfied. "You ought to be careful. Those boys, they aren't the kind you want around here." Clara's voice was steady. "Sheriff, with respect, there are plenty of folks in this town who've made it clear they don't want me around here either. The difference is, those men never raised a hand to me. Can't say the same for some who sit in your pews on Sunday." The sheriff stiffened, his jaw tight. He tipped his hat again, curt this time, and left without another word. Clara watched his taillights fade, her chest heavy but proud. She had spoken her truth, and truth carried its own power. In the weeks that followed, the bond between Clara and the angels deepened. They began visiting her not just as protectors, but as friends. They helped mend her fence, chopped wood for her stove, and carried groceries when her arms grew weak. She, in turn, offered them warmth that had nothing to do with fireplaces, meals cooked with love, prayers spoken with conviction, and stories that reminded them of mothers and grandmothers they had lost along the way. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the horizon, Clara found herself sitting on the porch with the youngest of the bikers, a man who had barely crossed into adulthood. He was quiet, more gentle than the rest, with eyes that held both pain and longing. "Miss Clara," he said, his voice low. "Why'd you let us in that night? You didn't know us. We could have hurt you." Clara rocked gently in her chair, her hands folded in her lap. "Baby, I've lived long enough to know you can't measure a man by his rumors. Storm didn't care who you were, and I reckon the Lord didn't either. All I saw were 9 souls freezing on my doorstep. That was enough." He swallowed hard, his throat working. "Ain't nobody ever looked at us like that. Not without fear. Not without judgment." Clara turned her gaze to him, her eyes soft but piercing. "Everybody deserves a place at the table, child. Sometimes it just takes someone to set it." The young man nodded, blinking back tears he tried to hide. In that moment, Clara realized something deeper than protection was happening. These men, branded as outlaws, written off by society, were finding in her something they had been starved of: unconditional dignity. And in them, she was finding a kind of respect that had been too long denied her. Yet, as with all things, the world did not leave them untouched. One night, Clara's porch light flickered against the dark as voices rose in the distance. A group of locals, emboldened by drink and prejudice, had come with words dipped in venom. "She's in league with criminals," one shouted, "bringing shame to this town." Clara stood on her porch, shawl wrapped tight, facing them with the steel that only years of endurance could forge. "You want to call me names? Do it to my face. But don't you dare tell me who I can or can't show kindness to." The crowd jeered, but before the words could turn to action, engines roared in the distance. 9 headlights pierced the night, the angels arriving like shadows made flesh. They parked in a line, silent, their presence a wall that silenced the mob. The leader stepped forward, his voice calm but sharp. "This lady's under our protection. Anybody got a problem with that? Then you got a problem with us." Silence fell. The locals, their courage drained, retreated into the night. Clara exhaled slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she leaned on the porch rail. The leader turned to her, his eyes soft. "You shouldn't have to face that, Miss Clara. Not ever." She smiled faintly. "Child, I've been facing them my whole life. But I'll admit, it feels mighty good not to be facing it alone." The night air settled around them, heavy with unspoken truth. Something larger than chance was unfolding. Clara had given shelter in a storm, and in return, she had found not just protectors, but family forged in the unlikeliest of places. And yet, Clara knew the story wasn't finished. Life had a way of testing vows, of pushing bonds to the edge. The question was not whether the angels would protect her in moments of crisis. They already had, but how far that protection would go when the world came knocking harder than ever before. Spring crept slowly into the valley, thawing the snow that had long blanketed the fields. The river swelled, the earth softened, and with it came both renewal and unrest. Miss Clara tended her small garden, her hands in the soil, her body bent but steady. She found peace in the rhythm of planting, of coaxing life from the dirt, even when the world beyond her fence often denied her that same patience. But the world never stayed quiet for long. One afternoon, as the scent of blossoms drifted on the breeze, Clara's quiet was broken by the crunch of boots outside her gate. She looked up to see 3 deputies standing there, hands resting casually on the grips of their holstered guns. Their uniforms gleamed under the sun, but their expressions carried the weight of authority sharpened by suspicion. "Afternoon, Miss Clara," the tallest one drawled. "Mind if we come in for a word?" Clara straightened slowly, brushing the dirt from her hands. Her voice remained calm. "If it's respect you're bringing, you're welcome. If it's trouble, best keep it on the other side of my gate." The men exchanged glances, faint smirks tugging at their mouths. Still, they stepped inside. "We've had complaints," the deputy continued. "Says you've been harboring criminals, hosting biker gangs on your property. You understand how that looks." Clara's eyes narrowed. "What I understand is that 9 men came to my door in need, and I gave them warmth. Since then, they've done nothing but show me kindness. If that's a crime, then maybe y'all ought to rethink your law books." The deputy's smirk faded. "Just know this. We'll be watching. Can't have folks thinking you're running with outlaws." Clara lifted her chin, the steel in her gaze unshaken. I've lived long enough to know being watched is nothing new. Do what you must. I'll do what I know is right. The deputies left, their boots pounding like warnings in the dirt. Clara exhaled, steadying herself. She had faced far worse in her lifetime, but she also knew this was not the end. The world had a way of punishing black women who dared to stand firm. And now she carried not only her dignity, but also the weight of the vow 9 bikers had made to her. That evening, the Angels arrived. Engines rumbled down the lane, 9 machines pulling up like sentinels. Clara told them what had happened, her words calm but edged with truth. The leader's jaw tightened as he listened. "They think you're alone, Miss Clara," he said, "but you're not. They want to keep eyes on you? Then they'll have to keep eyes on us too." From that night forward, their presence grew more deliberate. The Angels rode through her road often, their thunder rolling across the valley. They never lingered long, never caused disturbance, but the town noticed. And with every pass of their engines, whispers turned sharper. The local diner buzzed with talk. "She's in bed with criminals," some said. "Those bikers are using her place as a hideout," others insisted. Prejudice had always lived in that town, quiet but steady. Now it had found a new excuse to raise its voice. Clara ignored the whispers, as she always had. But trouble has a way of finding those who carry themselves with dignity in places where dignity is unwelcome. It came one night as Clara sat reading by her lamp. The creak of wood outside made her pause. At first, she thought it was wind. But then came the unmistakable sound of footsteps circling her house. She froze, her heart thudding. Voices slurred by drink followed, cruel laughter echoing through the night. "Old witch," one voice sneered. "Think you can bring your biker trash into our town? We'll teach you a lesson." Fear clawed at her chest, but Clara rose, standing tall. She reached for the phone, her hand trembling, but before she could dial, headlights pierced the night. Engines roared like an answering thunder, shaking the ground. The Angels had arrived. 9 bikes pulled up, their riders dismounting with swift, precise movements. The intruders froze, their laughter choking into silence. The leader of the Angels stepped forward, his leather jacket creaking as he squared his shoulders. "You boys lost." His voice was low, dangerous in its calm. The men stammered, their courage evaporating. Without another word, they fled into the dark, leaving Clara's yard in silence once more. Clara opened her door, her shawl wrapped tightly around her. Her eyes met the leader's, gratitude shining beneath her composure. "You always show up just in time." The man nodded. "We told you, Miss Clara. Nobody lays a hand on you. Not while we're breathing." From then on, the bond between them was no longer just spoken. It was lived, proven in action. The bikers became a fixture in Clara's life. They repaired her roof when the spring rains leaked through. They hauled supplies when her strength faltered. And when loneliness pressed heavy in the evenings, they sat on her porch, trading stories under the stars. But it wasn't just Clara they were changing. Something about her presence, her steady kindness, her unshaken dignity, began to shape them too. These men, hardened by lives of violence, rejection, and roads paved with shadows, found in her a reflection of something they had lost. The wisdom of a grandmother and the grace of a matriarch who saw them not as outlaws, but as souls worth saving. One night, as the fire crackled in her hearth, Clara looked at them gathered in her living room. The walls were lined with laughter, with the sound of spoons scraping bowls of her stew, with the rare comfort of men who felt at home in a world that often treated them as disposable. "You boys carry a name that scares folks," she said gently, her voice carrying weight. "But fear doesn't make a man. What he chooses to do with his strength, that's what tells the world who he is." The room fell silent. Each man lowered his gaze, her words piercing deeper than any sermon. "Out there," she continued, "they see leather and tattoos and trouble. But I see sons. Sons who just needed somebody to open the door when the storm came knocking." Tears glistened in the eyes of more than one hardened biker that night. But storms never last forever. The true test of their vow arrived in the form of law. Months later, flashing lights filled Clara's yard once again, this time brighter and harsher. Squad cars lined her lane, their engines humming like predators circling prey. The sheriff stepped out, papers in hand. "Miss Clara," he announced loudly, so all the neighbors watching from a distance could hear. "We have a warrant to search your property. Reports say you've been aiding and abetting criminal activity." Clara's stomach dropped. "Criminal activity? I've done no such thing." "Those bikers," the sheriff said, his tone sharp. "They're wanted in connection with multiple investigations, and you've been harboring them." The Angels were there too, arriving just minutes behind. Engines cut, boots crunched, and they stood in a line between Clara's porch and the deputies. The air crackled with tension. The night balanced on a knife's edge. Clara stepped forward, her shawl fluttering in the wind. Her voice rose, steady and commanding. "You want to search my home, Sheriff? Then you better be ready to explain to this whole town why you came after an old black woman who's done nothing but feed hungry men and mend broken fences." Her words struck like thunder. Neighbors shifted uneasily. The sheriff hesitated, his eyes darting between Clara's unwavering gaze and the wall of bikers behind her. The silence stretched until finally, with a curse under his breath, the sheriff crumpled the warrant in his hand. "This isn't over," he spat, retreating to his car. Clara stood tall, her heart pounding, but her spirit unbroken. Around her, the Angels formed a circle of loyalty, their promise stronger than ever. The night sky seemed to lean in, holding its breath. For Clara, it was no longer about storms of snow or storms of prejudice. It was about the truth that dignity, once given and once protected, could stand against anything. And for the Angels, it was about more than a vow. It was about a woman who had taken them in, who had shown them that even outlaws could be sons, even broken men could be redeemed. The world had tested their promise, and still they stood. But the greatest test was yet to come, one that would push them all to the edge of sacrifice and prove once and for all what it truly meant to swear protection for life. Summer arrived heavy and hot, pressing the valley beneath a blanket of restless air. Crops rose in the fields, cicadas hummed from the trees, and life appeared deceptively ordinary. But beneath that stillness, tension rippled like thunder beneath the earth. The sheriff's failed attempt to shame Miss Clara had not silenced the whispers. It had multiplied them. Neighbors spoke with lowered voices, their suspicions feeding like wildfire. The sight of the Angels riding down Clara's lane had become a spectacle. Some children watched in awe, while others were dragged indoors by parents who hissed warnings. For Clara, it was nothing new. She had lived too many years under the gaze of suspicion, the sting of slander, and the weight of judgment. But this time, the prejudice was sharper, cutting not only toward her, but also toward the men who had vowed to protect her. And then, one scorching afternoon, trouble came crashing through the valley with a roar louder than engines. It began with fire. Clara had been baking cornbread when the first whiff of smoke reached her. She frowned, stepping outside, only to see a plume rising from the edge of her field. The dry stalks caught quick, flames licking higher with each gust of wind. Panic seized her chest. She grabbed a bucket, but the blaze spread too fast, too wild. Before she could even cry out, the Angels arrived. Engines tore down the dirt lane, men leaping off their bikes, shouting orders. Jackets were flung aside as they formed a line, beating back flames with shovels, jackets, anything they could grab. Clara stood frozen, watching her yard transform into a battlefield. Hours seemed to pass in minutes. Sweat poured, arms swung, voices rose above the roar. And when it seemed the fire would consume everything, rain broke through the clouds as if heaven itself had chosen sides. The downpour hissed against the flames, drowning them until only smoke remained. Clara dropped to her knees, tears mingling with the rain. The men stood around her, soaked, exhausted, faces streaked with ash. But every one of them was smiling. They had saved her home. Yet as the smoke cleared, so did the truth. In the blackened edge of her field, Clara found the charred remains of bottles filled with gasoline. This fire was no accident. It was an attack. Her heart sank, not with fear, but with sorrow. She had expected resistance, but the cruelty of burning an old woman's home went beyond malice. It was hatred plain and raw. That night, the angels gathered in her living room, the air thick with unspoken rage. The leader's fists clenched as he paced. They wanted to kill you, Miss Clara. They wanted to erase you. Clara, sitting in her worn chair, lifted her head. Her voice was soft but steady. Hate has tried to erase me all my life. But here I stand, and I won't give it the satisfaction of fear. Her words tempered the room like water on fire. The men lowered their heads, the fury in them bending into something heavier, resolve. In the weeks that followed, the angels became a wall around Clara. They took shifts riding through her lane, their engines a warning to anyone thinking of harm. They fixed the scorched edges of her fields. They even painted her fence anew, the white boards gleaming brighter than before. But peace never lasts when hatred is denied its victory. Late one evening, as Clara prepared for bed, headlights appeared at the far end of the lane. Not the steady glow of neighbors, not the thunder of familiar engines. This was different, shadows moving with intent. Clara's stomach turned as 3 trucks pulled into her yard, men spilling out with bats and chains. Their faces were twisted with drink and rage. "Time to end this," one shouted. "No more biker mama running this town." Clara froze. For a moment, she was that little girl again, hiding as crosses burned in the night. But before fear could root itself, the ground began to rumble. Engines. The angels came like a storm. 9 bikes roared into the yard, circling the trucks in a blaze of noise and light. The men stumbled back, startled by the sudden fury of machines. The leader dismounted first, his boots striking the ground like hammers. His voice was low, deadly calm. "You brought chains to a grandmother's house? You think that makes you men?" The intruders sneered, but their courage faltered. Still, one lunged forward, bat raised. In a flash, an angel stepped between, the bat clanging harmlessly off leather and steel. Chaos erupted, shouts, clashes, the sound of wood splintering against fists. Clara stood on her porch, her hands trembling, her heart pounding. But she did not scream. She did not hide. She raised her voice, stronger than the storm. "Enough!" The word cut through the chaos, freezing the yard. Every man turned toward her, their breath heaving, their eyes wide. Clara stepped forward, her shawl slipping from her shoulders, her figure bathed in the glow of headlights. "I have lived too long to watch boys destroy themselves in the name of hate. You came here to hurt me? I will not bow. You came here to fight? Then you've already lost." Her voice carried the weight of generations, the unbroken chain of women who had endured and endured. Silence stretched across the yard until, slowly, the intruders began to retreat. One by one, they climbed back into their trucks, engines sputtering as they fled into the night. The angels remained, standing guard until the last echo faded. Then, at last, they turned to Clara. She met their eyes, her face wet with tears. "You kept your word," she whispered. "You swore to protect me. And you did." The leader nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "We'll keep swearing it, every day, for as long as we breathe." And so they did. The months turned into years. The fires of hatred never fully vanished, but they could no longer consume Clara's home, her dignity, or the bond forged in a blizzard long ago. The angels remained her protectors, but more than that, they became her family. They brought her groceries, fixed her roof, rode her to town when she grew too tired to walk. They sat at her table, called her Mama Clara, and meant it with every fiber of their being. When Clara grew frail, they carried her gently, their rough hands transformed by love. When she laughed, their hardened faces softened. And when she told her stories of struggle, of survival, of standing tall when the world tried to break her, they listened with reverence like disciples before a prophet. The vow they had made in the snow had become more than a promise of protection. It had become a covenant of love, of respect, of dignity shared between souls who once might never have crossed paths. And when the day finally came, when Clara's chair sat empty, her garden untended, her voice gone quiet, the angels rode. 9 bikes thundered through the valley, engines roaring not with fury but with grief. The whole town watched as they carried her memory like a banner, their jackets gleaming in the sun, their tears hidden behind dark glasses. For Clara, the black grandmother who had opened her door in a storm, they rode not in mourning but in honor. She had taken them in, not as criminals, not as outcasts, but as sons. And they had kept their word, not as outlaws, but as men bound by love and dignity. Her legacy lived on in the stories whispered across the valley, in the children who asked about the roar of engines on quiet nights, in the faces of men who had been transformed by her courage. Because once, in the heart of a blizzard, a grandmother had chosen compassion over fear. And from that choice grew a vow so unbreakable that even time could not erase it. The angels never forgot. They never broke their word. And in every mile they rode, every storm they braved, her spirit rode with them for life.